So this is session 5. The focus of this session is to explore the challenges and offer a lightweight analytics solution that still delivers a measuring and a tracking implementation that can allow for meaningful decision making in the new age of HIPAA and PII compliance. So if you're in here hoping for some chat GBT stuff, you're here in the wrong one. But otherwise, yeah, you're in the great place. So first off, I want to say thank you. You know, my friends have been listening to me talk about PII for probably 3 months now. They're probably sick of it. But no, I appreciate them and everyone who's given me critical feedback on this, and just excited and grateful to have a career in analytics. So the way that I structured this presentation, I'll kind of introduce you to myself and what I do, and then we'll really dig deep into some of the challenges facing analytics and analytics tracking, specifically in healthcare. We'll talk about some solution concepts, then do a comparison, and then I hope to run you through a quick implementation of the solution that I propose, which, spoiler alert, it's GA4 server-side. So basically, through Uplift Analytic, which is kind of a startup agency I founded, we do GA4 implementations. Most recently, we also do GA4 server-side implementations. So, we kind of do the full service offering, but we're really focused on analytics. So creating the correct data collection schemas, building your data pipeline, data visualizations, and then some really interesting stuff with SEO and SEM analysis. I threw ML in there. This is the only time in the presentation you're going to hear me say AI, because I guess that falls into that bucket. But we're really focused recently on healthcare, and so lots of PHI considerations, lots of PII considerations, and we basically function as an outsourced agency. So if that's something you want to speak about, got a website, got plenty of other spiels on that, but I'll save that. A little bit about myself. I've been running Uplift Analytic for about 4 years. In addition, my day job is 7 years on the agency side, as well as 2 years on the client side. I've also done some instructing and whatnot, but really my focus has been architecting Google and Adobe implementations. So whether it's Google Tag Manager, Google Analytics, GA4, Adobe Target, Adobe Launch, tags, you name it, I've probably touched it or messed it up once or twice, but we get it right. I've had the privilege with working with some of the great projects with some of these companies. So healthcare has really been a focus throughout. With that, let's get into the challenges in analytics. What you're looking at right here is basically out-of-the-box data that you can collect in GA4. If you're in analytics, you already know that you can basically collect anything. But this is out of the box, everything from city-level data, marketing more data like campaign ID, and then things that get a little bit data science-y, like cohort, month, things where you can really do some hard mathematical analysis. Now, with so much data you're collecting, and there's really no boundary to the data you can collect, there comes the question of what are you doing with the data, who are you exposing, whose data privacy is being considered. So, that's kind of why legislation passes really quickly with popular support, because the consumer and the patient is always very interested, including governmental agencies, are very interested in, where is this data? How's it being stored? Are you getting permission to use this data? So these are the topics that really come up in conversation whenever there's a legal discussion. You've probably heard it throughout some of the other sessions that you've attended today. But the graphic on the right kind of shows, and this is 2015, so keep that in mind. But folks consider themselves high integrity individuals. Below that is the medical profession, which may have changed with COVID, but that's a different topic. But at the very bottom, at the very bottom, you'll see marketing and advertising. But, that's even below U.S. politicians, so that's rough. But we're here right now. But I think, if we do these sorts of compliant solutions for clients with not only the legal ramifications in mind, but also the best patient experience, the best user experience, we can change that and build the trust and the brand reputations that'll hopefully bump us up this list. And analytics engineers and experts will be more looked at as, they're data stewards rather than folks trying to steal my data. So let me walk you through a scenario. A marketer or an analytics engineer wants to do some tracking on their site. So they're looking at options. They stumble across a great tracking pixel or solution. And so they read about it, because we do a lot of reading. Half of our life is Google search sometimes, I feel. But you go on the website and they talk about promoting transparency and positive uses of experiences, all these things that make you feel good. So you're like, okay, well, safety, privacy, security, let's do it. Let's implement it. You put that pixel on your site. A little while later, there's a user at home. He or she is thinking that, or they are thinking that, I'm on my private healthcare site for my healthcare provider. I'm going to do a search. It's totally secure and safe. Let me look up, I'm having a rough time. Maybe it's depression. Maybe it's a broken knee, whatever it may be. But they think that search is between them and their healthcare provider site. At the same time, an advertiser somewhere has no idea that their ad is being remarketed in a certain dimension. They just know, we did everything in our compliance. We did this ad. Now we're remarketing. Great. But what the user then sees is an ad for an anxiety or a depression medication. And the user's like, whoa, how does a computer, or whatever level of technical understanding they have, how does the computer know that I search for this or I'm interested in this? That's weird. They're using my information somehow. I don't know how. And so this would be a huge violation, because basically you installed a tag, or whoever installed a tag, on a site. It's collecting PHI and perhaps even PII, and now it's remarketing based on that with no consent, no permission, no real transparency for the actual user, or in this case, the patient, the prospective patient. So this is what the user sees: a bunch of irrelevant ads, maybe something that is a little unsettling to them, knowing that they didn't give up that information willingly. And then, the user's angry, the user's disappointed, the user doesn't feel good about the experience. There's diminished trust in the brand that they just invested in their time. And then, they're probably pointing, just like our soy jack meme, they know my data, they have my data, they're stealing my data. And they might reach out to friends. They might even get their lawyer involved or reach out. What do the lawyers see? What are the legal ramifications? Well, this exact situation happened at Facebook. And so there's a huge settlement out there. So if you want to check at some point to see if they owe you any money or anything, definitely worth a go. But importantly, this doesn't just happen for Facebook. This happens for healthcare systems. So healthcare systems are being fined for being non-compliant under new guidelines. And that's very disconcerting and definitely warrants perhaps paying more attention to what your data is being captured and how you're protecting patient and user data. So here's another fun fact. Zuckerberg San Francisco General, it's basically funded by our favorite Facebook owner, and he does a lot of philanthropy. But basically, if you look at the site and you look at the tags that are involved, there's no Facebook pixel here. So without saying, if you had a pixel and it were compliant, you would probably put it on a site that you're paying for, but it's not here. So you have to be very careful with all that transparency talk and security talk, that things are legally covered and that you're following best practices. Another note here is that when it comes to legislation versus innovation, a lot of us probably followed the Facebook and the internet congressional hearings on how things are being used. I think Senator Blumenthal asked questions that, most of the folks in this room could answer fairly aptly, but it seemed as if there was a disconnect between what the policymakers knew and the actual tech community knows. So right now, we're going to have cookieless tracking implemented by Google, and we have all this regulation around cookies and whatnot. Well, looking forward, and I discovered this in 2015, this is basically fingerprinting that is completely cookieless. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that where the tech is and where the policy is are in two completely different places. The tech is usually far ahead. So as we're making decisions as analytics engineers, as marketers, it's important to kind of not think about now, but think about where things could go. And this is pretty cool if you ever get a chance. It's a cool tool to check out. So with that, let's move on to healthcare analytics. This is Google's kind of privacy policy around information in general. So, they're a reputable company. They do a lot of great things, but they mention IP masking, which is out of the box for GA4. That's very important, and then compliance with GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act. But, this is a statement, but this doesn't really absolve the implementer or anyone of legal liability in the case that, info is leaked, or, this is just kind of their statement that they are compliant. A quick run through of compliance laws here. If you work in healthcare, HIPAA, 1996, mandated how records can be handled. Everyone has to do HIPAA training. Not everyone, patient records are safeguarded and whatnot. But it took about 20 years for GDPR to come around. And that's the EU privacy law about how my data is collected, where my data is stored, and how I can access the data that other companies have. And this kind of kick-started the movement, because if you want to do business in the EU, you might as well had to push all of your sites and web properties towards their legislation. So here we see CCPA, which is the California Privacy Act. Pretty straightforward, doesn't do much different than GDPR. But what's changed is things are coming out more rapidly. So if we look at the top, the HHS bulletin in December basically tamed all of our analytics tracking. So before, when we were doing analytics tracking, it was, we're just going to encrypt emails. We're going to do these PII saves. But now when we think about it, this bulletin says anytime you're collecting anything that could be related to a medical condition or a healthcare situation, you have to be very cognizant and follow stricter guidelines. So, existing best practices, people have taken their email and encrypted it when it was submitted in forms. This is still the case. This is how you protect against PII. And I'm not saying any of these sites, if you recognize them, are doing anything wrong. They're probably doing everything right. It's the UI that could be done wrong if you see it on other sites where this isn't the case. So if someone were searching, I have this condition up top, that could identify someone depending on what condition they're putting in. At the same time, someone could be, something could be scraping the DOM for a value that would include maybe the login user's name, and then if they're searching medical conditions. So this is very serious site search, especially for healthcare terms. Another thing is symptom checker compliance. While you're not necessarily, this could or couldn't be PII, this could identify folks, because after you answer 10 of these questions, you probably have a very unique profile. So whenever you're doing this, you have to follow the bulletin to the letter. Another thing here is if you use a location search, and this is an extremely rare disease, how many people in this zip code are going to have this disease. So another thing to be very cognizant of as you're implementing analytics. Another telling sign is if you're trying to do cross-tracking. Like this is basically my chart, which is an Epic product. If you wanted to put code on their portal, that's almost like a complete no-go. It's very difficult to do because they understand the ramifications of a tag manager on the back of their code that may or may not be compliant. So basically what the new bulletin and the HIPAA compliance really amounts to is that as a collector of data, you have to ensure the confidentiality. You have to be able to say where your data is, where it exists, if you're storing it somewhere, you have to have a BAA with that vendor, unless it's like in your office on a server, which I don't know how many folks can afford to do that or do that on a smaller scale. But what it really outlines is that data collection isn't the issue. You can collect data as much as you need within reason, or you know, if you want to get crazy, however you want. But storage is the issue. So you can't just have data on a Google server. You can't just have data out there. You need to specifically like know where that data is and touch it.
So when you say data storage, is the data caching is also part of data storage, or caching is not part of data storage?
It could be depending on your situation. You know, I think local storage wouldn't affect that if that's what you're talking about.
If you are I'm collecting the data does get cached a lot of times.
Right.
Could be logged into some log messages. What is the definition of storage? Because today nothing's even everything in the memory is eventually gets dumped to the storage.
Yeah, I think if it's on a device, you know, I'd have to look a little further at that situation. But if it's on a device, it might not fall under, you know, you as the collector's issue. That might be on their computer. But that's I think that's something to investigate a bit further. So the solutions that I've kind of looked at here, the current state of analytics, if you're not using server-side, you're basically creating an environment where you have your site and it's collecting data, but that data is being pre-processed somewhere. And since you can't assure where that pre-processing is taking place, you know, even if it's a Google or an Amazon instance or, you know, whatever server that's quote-unquote secure, and you can't have a BAA signed with them, you know, that's not the way to do it. That could prompt a violation. And you know, so if you do it in a server-side manner, all the data that you're collecting on the site, unless something is, you know, again on local storage or is on a computer that a user is using, it's basically going to your server, and your server is secure. Everyone who accesses the data there has a BAA with you, and you are the gatekeeper. There is no middleman between you and your patient's data. So you have complete ownership of that, and you are the de facto data steward. So if we go through the platforms, you know, there's platforms that do this. They all have to be HIPAA compliant, sign a BAA, and then also obviously CCPA compliant. Some of the options that we're looking at here, there's tons of startups that are trying to push into this space. Adobe does this, and then Google server-side J4, which is the one I'm pushing today and think is a valid solution for someone who's a smaller fish in the pond here. But important to note is that when you look at Adobe, this is Adobe CJA. So when we're talking about Adobe Analytics, they are explicitly not signing BAAs this time. So it's very, you know, you have to use this new Adobe CJA product. And it's very new. I was at Adobe Summit last month, and I listened to folks from Best Buy talk about how they implemented it. So it is an expensive implementation. If you're an underdog or a small system, that's going to be perhaps prohibitively expensive as far as resources go. The startups are options. There's some great solutions coming out there, but as we go through, I'll kind of highlight some of the weaknesses there. So Google does all these. GA4 server-side does all of this. And you get to use your Google Tag Manager if you're a GTM aficionado. Moving on to the Google Cloud. Again, we've got our server representation. So basically in this example, GA4 would be installed on your own server. It wouldn't be out here on Google's, like some random server that Google picks in a drawer somewhere in Palo Alto or wherever, you know, anywhere in the world that Google operates. The server container is running on the device and talks directly to your server, and there's no pre-processing by other folks having access to your data. You know, data collection. Too excited here. Data collection, you know, you can do Google server side on other servers. You could do an AWS instance. I haven't explored that. That looks a bit complicated because Google obviously wants to keep you within their silo. But Google, again, does not have access to the data flowing into your server. They're willing to sign a BAA with you, and PHI isn't collected unless you're anonymizing it and doing some of the encryption. That's pretty standard before and after this. Data storage, the great thing about this situation is you don't have to sign up for a plan. If you use Adobe, you have to sign up for a certain amount of server calls and whatnot. If you use a Google server instance, you basically get to decide how much data you need to use and expand that as it goes on. There's no contract that you have to sign per se to get started, especially for smaller systems. And then you can also tie things together from other places, like maybe you have Salesforce data that you've anonymized and you want to put in a data table somewhere, you want to create your own data lake. It really is at the mercy or at the whim of your data engineers as to what you can do, which I know for a lot of the startup solutions is not the case. Again, I think the Google Cloud is amazing because for kind of a smaller start, Google server side is a way for Google to push their cloud offering, and so they are very invested in this and getting folks to transfer. Again, they'll sign the BAA and they'll do the you'll have the reliability of their server uptime.
When you say they'll sign BAA, you're talking about just any old BAA a hospital or clinic might provide?
I think you'd have to negotiate that, but
Sure.
that's
You have a standard BAA.
Yeah, but I mean, I think if this is the part where you'd have to get legal involved and you'd have to look at it, but if you're talking about any other solution, they're just not going to sign it. So it's.
So Google is the only one that will get you to a BAA path with the service provider.
Yes, and the Adobe, Adobe will get you there, but you have to buy a certain product here, and other startups are probably more willing to work with you as far as what that BAA looks like, but as a standard solution and as thinking about it, I think this is definitely one of the strongest options. Again, the cost and the transparency is also very strong, because if you're thinking about this as a smaller fish in the pond, you're thinking about how much is this going to cost. If we wanted to do this tomorrow, like how much is the startup cost? And a lot of these solutions, I mean, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that's a tough barrier to entry. So the next thing is very important, because all the data in the world doesn't do much for you if you can't have it the way that you want it. With GA4 server side installed, it's an out-of-the-box reporting solution. So basically, you're using the platform, but it's hosted on your server. So there's the familiarity piece. No one has to necessarily learn anything other than GA4. But another important piece is the ETL process. So if you're using another solution that's probably more of a startup thing, they're going to say, you need an enterprise tier to get data out of your system. And that's not good either. So you're going to be in kind of a tough spot there, working around how to do the ETL process without doing their tiered system. So the implementation basics, you'd get your BAA signed, you'd get your your server configuration set up, and then you'd get your tag managers, get all your tags transferred. And from there, you would then be able to do some of the more data stewardship pieces, deciding how you want to connect or what you would like to connect as far as analytics reporting. Most of the folks in this room pretty familiar with clients and servers, so I'll just save this slide for you. Basically, assuming you've got your cloud instance set up within the Google Cloud, here you would you'd basically want to start by setting up a Google. You'd create a server container in your Google Tag Manager that would host your Tag Manager. So then you would just verify. These are pretty simplified steps. So as we go through them, but then you would verify your domain DNS so that you are allowed to interact with your GTM container. Since my computer's dying, moving a little quick here. But then in your Google Tag Manager, you would then specify the ID and the address that you're trying to send the data to. And then when you install it on your site, you would change the request path to, thank you. You would change the request path to reference not Google's orientated ID, but your own server location. And so that's kind of what that process would look like. Again, your data would probably end up in a BigQuery table, and then you could work with it just like any other data set within BigQuery and the rest of the Google Cloud. This is great because then you have access to the rest of the Google ecosystem, and you can use BigQuery ML. You can push it again, ETL process it any way you want without paying premiums for specific plans. And you know, you'd have native or near native support and integration within the Google Cloud, which if you use a third-party platform or you use something else, it's very difficult to get something out of the walled garden that is typical of, you know, the Adobe or other providers. With that, you know, I'm open for Q&A.
Maybe I missed this since I was a few minutes late, but how about beyond HIPAA, high-tech, GDPR? Is there a solution for that?
So GDPR is kind of out of the box with GA4. You know, as long as you're going by their rules, you might have to, since if it is a medical situation and you're working with patient data, you might have to follow hosting rules, like maybe host your GA4 server in a EU country or something like that.
Will they sign the data processing agreement?
I don't have much experience with the EU, but I know, you know, in the US it's up for discussion.
So yeah, thanks for talking about Google server side. I wasn't aware of that. Yeah, that's good. I was wondering if anything there was going to touch on like Apple's differential privacy type approaches to doing this kind of stuff. Are you aware? Can you comment?
You know, I've got a Chromebook here and an Asus here, so I'm not very familiar with Apple. I'm assuming like they probably have a leading solution. As with Apple, they're usually very premium, so they probably are not going to be, you know, we have a small clinic with 4 practitioners and 20 employees. We'd like to implement something for tracking. So, sorry, I'll start here.
You had a slide where you had in with an exclamation point, data collection is not the issue, data storage is the issue. So I've had my personal data breached 3 times, federal government, including a security clearance application, so most of my childhood. Make the value proposition for why storage is the important thing and not the collection.
I think, you know, obviously we could go off the walls with we could collect anything, but I think what we're talking about is like, and I'm sorry if I didn't clarify that in my presentation, is we're talking about things where like a lot of healthcare providers, they'll hear this sort of talk and they will yank everything from the site. There is no more tracking, which leads to bad marketing and that sort of thing. You don't even know who you're targeting, you don't know the user experience. So when we're talking about tracking and collecting, it's more like the UI in the actual site. So, you know, can we track someone's use of the search button? And that's kind of the collection piece I'm more pushing towards, of like the UI on the site.
Does it ever shrink?
The collection of the data? Or, I mean, I think folks are collecting more and more data, and so, you know, I think as an industry we've always worked to encrypt PII or encrypt or not include. With Google, you can say, you know, I want to track anything below the state level. So I think if you don't need the data, you shouldn't collect it as a practitioner. But again, you know, folks have been doing stuff even 5 years ago where they're tracking your internet speed and drawing that as a fingerprint and then tracking you based off that. So you know. No, I'm 100% with you. You have to kind of, it's a judgment call. Sorry.
As far as tracking or keeping HIPAA compliant data that's not analytics related, are there Google Cloud offerings that help with that process? I mean, you know, you'd be getting a BA not with just an analytics provider, but you know, these lessons also apply to how we might do that for, you know, save data in a user account information, things like that. Like, are there offerings there to help?
I am used to kind of a Salesforce-y situation. I'm sure Google offers, but like, I haven't worked with it personally. I think that would be like that'd be really compliance, right?
Salesforce-y situation in what way?
So you're connecting it to maybe someone submitted a form that includes their personal data to Salesforce, and then you're using a unique ID to tie that Salesforce data to your actual like Google Analytics ID sort of thing. Yeah.
I was going to say, are there any solutions out there that clearly say that they should never be used for a medical website?
I mean, I think there are a lot of solutions. Google's pushing into the space, and they have the reputation to do that. So, you know, I've really focused on that in Adobe. There's smaller ones who will like jump at the bit to do health insurance or to do banking sort of things. But again, you know, I've kind of kept it in the sphere.
So here's my question for you. Is general search data legally allowed to be used for medical marketing? Let's say I, as an individual, type into Google and I type in anxiety medication. Is it legal then for me to start getting ads on Instagram and Facebook for treatments such as Buspirone and Xanax and things of that nature? Is that legal?
That's a really important piece. We do a lot of analytics, you know, search term analytics, and what you'll find is that if you look at what folks are searching for in an organic search for your website, you'll see a lot of not set or not provided. Like, I think what I've seen on some sites is 85% of the searches that are organic for a healthcare system are not provided because Google knows that that's like iffy to collect. So you would have to have something else that would like, you know, I think Facebook is a little more sketchy in that regard.
So basically what you're saying is that in general, Google doesn't necessarily collect that data, but other sites do.
I would say Google takes that data, anonymizes it, and perhaps provides a screenshot, but you can't directly say like, this person searched for this leukemia treatment, let me start, you know. I think it's more of a demographic based of like, you know, 65 to whatever, and you know, at risk in this community, there's this clinic, let's, you know, like Medicare advertising sort of.
Okay, that makes sense.
Like a very similar question, but from the other end. If I'm making like a meditation iOS app, and I ask the user like, how are you doing today? And they type in, I'm depressed, or like, I have anxiety today. Like, am I suddenly in trouble for that? Like, when does it become PII?
Can I say some stuff here?
Definitely.
So since I'm doing a presentation later on HIPAA-related things as well, I mean, the key thing is HIPAA only covers covered entities, and that's kind of narrowly drawn, and it should really be updated. And covered entities and their business associates all end up covered, so it's sort of insidious and it spreads out. And so it's sort of like, if you're a health system, it's insidious, and so everything sort of ends up having to be compliant. Not necessarily, but it's sort of a legal gray area. Why wouldn't you do it, sort of a deal? If you want to get sued, you don't have the reputational risk. So like Google isn't inherently a covered entity necessarily, and they have enough legal resources to figure out what is and isn't okay to collect and use to serve you ads. And you can kind of see areas like the company that I work for, you know, we've been working in an area that's not actually a covered entity, but we totally should be a covered entity. But just because by the letter of the law, we haven't been covered.
How about the Google Terms of Service too?
Yeah, well, there's that. I mean,
They can do whatever they want.
you basically just read the law and you can read what the regulations say, and you can say, oh, this is a lot narrower than I thought it would be. And you know, the two main ideas are either to avoid identifying the individual.
Right, anonymized, blended.
Anonymized. The other idea is just you put a ton of resources into security, which is how you get data.
Yeah, and the whole thing is that like in 95% of the cases where folks are doing this or companies are doing this, no one's ever going to say anything. But that 5%, is that a gamble that a company with a good reputation and a good trust from consumers and brands and patients is willing to take? I would hesitate to say 5%. That's not good, you know, when these lawsuits range in the tens of hundreds of millions of dollars. So, yeah.
In the spirit of the beginning of your presentation of talking about how policy lags far behind technology, I know Google just released to a select group of people their generative healthcare AI. And so I wonder if you can kind of speak about how you think about how this data might be feeding AI in a way that data might not be vetted for an AI to consume in that way. I don't know if you've thought about how tags or things like that might be, you know, incorporated into that avenue.
That's really cool, actually. I haven't played much or heard much about that. But I do know that Google is collecting everything. And so when we're talking about Medtronic or something, they're slowly, you know, I can't speak for them. I can't speak for other large companies that do sort of healthcare stuff, but Google would probably love that data, you know? And so it's this move of like, Google could maybe get involved here, so why don't we move towards another platform? Maybe we do Adobe because Adobe isn't doing generative AI on healthcare data, so. All right. Well, this was my first one, and it was very exciting. Thank you, everyone.